Welcome back to part 3 of this Django course, where I'm going to be showing you how to set up your serializers to enable a production-ready API layer. Every full-stack application needs a robust API layer. Now, from building web applications with hundreds of thousands of users, ensuring that your API layer is harmonized, predictable, and safe is critical. Now, if you missed part 2 where we set up the models, the database tables for our Django project, definitely go back and visit that video because it will be needed in this part. Otherwise, let's get into it. As always, the full code and repository can be found on the Code Creations GitHub page, which will be linked down below in the description. And if you're following on from the previous part, then you'll already have all of these files and all of the setup, as you can see here in the left-hand side. So what are serializers? Well, serializers are a way for us to expose the database tables and the models through a unified framework. You don't always want your views, which is what we'll go through in the next part of the course, to interact directly with the database, to grab all the information manually, and then to format each object in a loop. This is just inefficient, and you're essentially going to be rewriting different formatting responses for each of your APIs. Instead, what you can do is you can unify the way that specific models from your database will be formatted for your API endpoints. And on top of that, you can also create serializers to help you manage the creation and updating of content within the database as well. So it's essentially a layer that sits in between the views and the models, and it makes it much more easy to maintain because you only have to maintain one piece of code, not every single API endpoint that utilizes that model. And to do this, we're going to use the Django REST Framework. So let's get into things. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to install the Django REST Framework package. So simply just copy that command and run that. That'll install the Django REST Framework. The next thing that you want to do is you want to add the REST framework into the installed apps section of the settings.py file. So come into here and just add this in here. This way the Django project knows that you need to and you want to utilize this package in the installed apps. And there's a few different serializers that we're going to create. So if you remember within our project, we have a few different apps. We have the users app, we have the core app, which stores all of the core tables to do with our learning management platform. And we have the lookups app as well, which stores just some metadata that's used across the application. Now we're just going to focus on the core models and the users models. And we're going to be making serializers for all of these models within these two apps. So we're going to be creating serializer for the user profile model and for all of the models within the core app as well. So we've got course, we've got module, lesson, enrollment, and lesson progress. So let's start with the users model. And there's actually two serializers that we're going to create here, which essentially roll up into one. So if I copy this and I come into the users folder, let's create a new file and let's name this serializers.py. And let's paste this. So what's happening here? Now, if you remember, in the users model, this is essentially an extension of the Django built-in user model. So we're extending the functionality of the default user model that comes with Django with a few extra fields within this user profile model. So we're linking the user and the user profile model through a one-to-one field. Naturally, there's going to be data that's stored against the user model. And then within the user profile model, we're essentially adding two new fields, which we can obviously add to more in the future as well. So for the serializer, we want a serializer for the user model and we want a serializer for the user profile model. And as you'll see, once we define the user serializer here, we tell it that it's pointing towards the user model and we tell it what fields we want to include from the user model. There's some more fields in here like date joined and last active and all that sort of stuff. But for now, we're just going to contain it to these fields here. Which means that when we pass a user object through the user serializer and we extract the data from it, it will essentially just give us these 5 fields for this user. Now if we come down to the user profile serializer, notice that we actually make use of the user serializer here. So when we're serializing a user profile object, we want to include all of the fields that are from the user serializer, so all of these 5 fields, and include these under a user variable. But then also for the profile, we also want to include these fields as well. So we've already got user, we've mentioned this already, but we're going to return the ID of the profile, the display name, and the bio. So it's pretty simple, to be honest. This shows how you can leverage one-to-one relationships by linking serializers together. So let's save this and let's go back. Now let's go to the course serializers, and there's quite a few here. So let me just go through one by one. We'll start off with the lesson serializer. So once again, come over to the core app and let's create a serializers.py file. Okay, so this serializer for the lesson is very similar to the user serializer. The lesson is kind of one of the leaf nodes. So you start with a course, then you go down to a module, and then you have the individual lessons. So there's not necessarily anything that we need to link within the lesson. So really all we need to do here is we just need to define which model the lesson serializer is connected to, so it's the lesson model, and which fields we want to return in the serialized response. So that's fairly straightforward. Now let me come back to the code snippet, and now let's go one level higher. So now that we've got the lessons, let's roll up our serialization and let's go to the modules. So now, as you can see, the modules are going to include a serialization for the lessons within that module. And then we simply just list all the fields that are associated with the module that we want to return as well. That's great, that's fairly straightforward. So this is kind of similar to the user profile serializer that we created within the users app. Now let's go a step further and let's look at a serializer for the course. So once again, we're going one level up now, above the modules to the actual course level of the hierarchy. So we want to include the modules, which will then utilize the module serializer, which will then utilize the lesson serializer. So there'll be a whole nested series of data that we'll include within the serialized form of the course. We're also including the instructors as well, which, if you remember from our course model, utilizes the default Django user model and is a many-to-many field. So this will serialize each instructor as an individual user serializer instance. And then we've got two additional fields here, which are not part of the database table: total lessons and completion rate. And here, what we're doing is we're utilizing a serializer method field. So I'll come back to this in just a moment. So if we keep going down, as usual, we're listing all of the fields that we want to return from the course model within the course serializer. And now we can focus on these serializer method fields. So if you define a variable here, a field here, such as total lessons, and you declare it as a serializer method field, then the naming convention with Django REST Framework instructs the serializer to look for a method within this class that uses the name of the field and simply just has get and then underscore at the beginning of it. So if we're declaring total lessons as a serializer method field, then what we need to do is we need to create a get total lessons method, and Django REST Framework will automatically know that this method here, so whatever data is returned by this method, corresponds to what we need to return for this field. So for the total lessons field, we're going to utilize this method here, and we're simply just going to return the total lessons for the course. Now this object that's passed here in the parameters is going to be an instance of course. So if we look at course, the course model definition, remember we set up a method here to return a very quick helper method of the number of lessons within this course. So that's why we're able to return this as a value. So the value for the total lessons field will essentially just be the value for the total number of lessons of that course object. And similarly with completion rate, once again we're utilizing a serializer method field here, and what this is going to do is it's going to check to see if there is an authenticated user within the context of the request. If there is an authenticated user, then we're going to check the completion for that user against the course. And once again, if I come back to the model definition, we already built this method into the course model. So this method here essentially checks that for a given user, give me the completion of this course for that particular user. So it's just leveraging that method that we used before. So these serializer methods here really are leveraging the methods that we implemented before on the underlying models, and gives you a really nice way to be able to enrich the responses of models as well, outside of just the standard fields that are available within the model. Okay, now let's look at the enrollment. So let's copy this. So what the enrollment is going to do is it's going to take the course and it's going to serialize the course. It's going to take a given user, because once again, if we go back to the enrollment table, this is essentially just stores a course, a user, and when they were enrolled at. So it's going to format a response for the course, the user, and we're going to leverage another serializer method field as well. So the amount of progress that the user has made as a percentage. And luckily, once again, if we look at the enrollment model, we created a method here which automatically calculates for a given user, so for the user that's saved against the enrollment object, what is the progress that they've made within this course. So we can just leverage that here as well. So the enrollment response should include the nested response for the course serializer, a response for the user, and then an additional field which tells us their progress percentage on this course. Okay, now finally, let's add one more serializer, which is the lesson progress serializer. So this will round out all of the models within the core app. This is quite simple. If we look at the lesson progress model once again, let's open this up. We're essentially just looking at a user, a lesson, whether it's completed, and at what time it was completed at. So for the serializer, we don't really need too much. We're just taking the user and we're serializing it from the user serializer that we created already. The lesson, once again, leveraging that respective serializer, and then we're just listing the fields that we want to return as well. So this is a more simple serializer. Great, so we've set up all of our serializers for the core app as well. And we've covered quite a lot there. We've seen how to leverage one-to-one fields. We've also seen computed fields using the serializer method fields. We've seen how to handle nested data. We've also dealt with many-to-many relationships, such as with the tags and the topics and the instructors within the course serializer. So this is all really good stuff. Now let's keep pressing. There are a few more things I'm going to run through, and then what will be most valuable is for us to actually run these serializers and for me to show you exactly what the data looks like when it gets passed through this serializer. Now another thing I want to quickly cover is a custom validation example. So for the lesson serializer, let me copy this method here. And let me come to the lesson serializer. So currently this lesson serializer will take in a lesson object, will format a response ready for our APIs with all these different fields, and will give us this response back. However, serializers can also be used to create and validate data within a model, as well as updating data within a model as well. And why is this useful? Well, even if you set very strict rules within your database, such as the maximum character lengths, the maximum numeric values of certain fields, it can happen that data outside of those validation boundaries can sneak into your database. So where you can, you want to add as many different layers of protection as possible. And the serializer is a great layer to add into this stack. So you've already seen how we can leverage serializers to format data coming from the database ready for an API. But as I said, you can also leverage methods and you can leverage serializers to protect data that's going into the database. So by adding this method here, once again, it uses the standard Django REST Framework naming convention, which is prefixing the method name with validate and then underscore. You could also just create a generic validate method here, like this. And then this would be a generic validation handler that would always get triggered when data is being saved in the database. However, by being more specific with the validate prefix and then what follows afterwards, this is going to be called when this specific field, duration seconds, gets updated. So if we go to the lesson model, we have a field called duration seconds. So whenever that field specifically is going to be updated, this validation handler is going to be fired. And essentially what it's saying is that if the duration in seconds is greater than 3,600 times by 4, so 4 hours, then raise an error. So as I said, this is good because it enforces consistency across your application. It doesn't rely on an admin to ensure that all of the data fits a certain validity. So this is really helpful. And then finally, there's just 2 more serializers that I want to create as well. And these are serializers for the course model. I'll explain why these are relevant. So let me just shrink some of these down and let me come over to the course section here. And I'm going to add 2 more serializers. So the first is a minimal serializer. So it's going to take in the course model, similar to the course serializer up here, but this time we're only returning 3 fields. Now why is this useful? There might be several parts of your application where a course is needed, or a response for a course is needed. But you might not necessarily need to return all of the data about all the modules and instructors and all of these extra fields for each of those 2 sections. So what you can do is you can create another serializer and name it something like this, where it just returns the minimal essential information for that particular part of the backend. And then you can take that one step further and you can say, okay, this might be useful for some parts of the application, but then what if I want to dynamically decide which fields to return as part of the API response? So using this course dynamic serializer, this once again takes in the course model, but within this method, so within the instantiation method, you need to pass in the keyword arguments an array of fields, so such as ID, name, slug, modules, etc., etc. So within the instantiation, you need to pass an array of fields that you want to include. And if those fields exist within the model, then it will return those fields for that model, which means that at runtime, you can essentially control which fields you want to return from the serializer. The reason why this is useful is because it gives you flexibility. With some of the more modern API frameworks as well, like GraphQL, it's quite common to request different fields from the front end to the back end. So this will enable you to work quite seamlessly with that too. So just revisiting both of these two serializers, the reason why they're important is one, so with the minimal serializer, you're not always going to need big payloads. And depending on the user or the client, they might only need minimal information, such as a drop-down list, for example. It also helps to support overfetching of data. You don't need to provide all the data if only a very small slice of it is needed. And with the dynamic serializer in particular, it will make your serializer and your responses dynamic to different user types, roles, or even devices, which is really handy. Okay, so that is everything that we're going to go through in terms of serializers. Now, let's get to the fun part. Let's actually start using some of these serializers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the two serializer files. And we're going to be working in the terminal now. And I'm going to try and zoom in a little bit more so that you can just see as much as possible. Okay, so let's start with the user serializer. Let's clear the terminal here. First of all, let's import our models from our user app. So we want to open up a shell first. Now, from users, models, import user profile. Now let's import the serializers. So from serializers Okay, so the way that we can essentially get the response back from this serializer is by passing a user profile object into this serializer. So we can do it like this. However, we don't currently have an object that we can pass in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create, I'm going to save it against the profile variable like this. And I'm going to say, give me the first user profile object within the database. And I can check to make sure that it's actually come back with something, and it has, so that's good. Now let's instantiate the serializer. And let's pass the profile into this. Good. So then if we return what this instance is, you can see it comes back with a user profile serializer instance. There's a whole bunch of metadata that comes back here. But to get the data that's ready for our API response, all we need to do is just call the data property within this instance. And you can see here, let me scroll down a bit, that we have our serialized response, which is safe to pass to our API endpoint. So this is great. As we have defined in the user profile model, so remember, we should have 4 fields here. We should have the ID of the profile, the user, the display name, and the bio. So we've got the ID, that's great. We've got user, which once again corresponds to the user profile serializer, which should include these 5 fields here. So yes, we've got ID, username, email, first name, last name, perfect. Then we've got the display name from the profile, and we've got the bio. So this has worked exactly how we wanted, so that's great. Now what I'm going to do to make the viewing experience for some of the serializers coming up a little bit easier is I'm going to pretty print them using JSON, because some of these responses will get quite large. So now let's go over to the core application, and what I need to do, I'm going to copy this in fact. I want to import all of the models from the core app. That's good. Now I want to import all of the serializers. So from core.serializers, import, we want the lesson serializer. We want the module serializer. Course. Course minimal. Course dynamic. Enrollment, and there should be one more, lesson progress. Great. So let's just go through this in order. Let's start with the lesson serializer. And to avoid me having to write out several different statements every single time, I'm going to print out, using JSON, the response from each of these serializers in a single line. So let me show you how to do this. So I'm going to print json.dumps, and then we're going to instantiate the serializer. So in this case, we're going to use lesson serializer. And then we're going to retrieve the lesson just within the instantiation. Okay, that closes off the lesson serializer, that closes off the JSON dumps, that closes off the print. But then what we want to do here is we want to call data. I missed something. So we got the right response, but let me just run it again with an additional parameter within the JSON dumps field. So that will be here, and we want to do indent equals to 4. Okay, need to go one more level up. Here we go. Here we go. Now this is printed out very nicely and it's much more readable. So this was for the lesson serializer, and this was for a lesson object, obviously. So if you might remember, we're simply just returning these fields here, and if you look at the response, you can see that we've got data for all these different fields. So that's perfect, that's exactly what we wanted. Now let's do the module serializer. So rather than writing this out again, I'm just going to copy this line, and I'm going to replace the model and the serializer. Okay, so this is for a module. So let's just revisit what the module serializer was returning. So we're going to get an array of lessons with that in serialized form, so all of the lessons in serialized form, so that's correct. And then we're going to get all of these extra fields for the module too. And that's exactly what we've got here. So we've got some of the fields for the module, we've got an array for the lessons, and all of these lessons have been serialized, and then we've got some extra metadata about the module as well. Perfect. Now let's go to the next one, which should be the course serializer. So we'll use the course object. We'll go to the course serializer, and before I run that, let's just double check what should get returned. So we should have modules, instructors, a number for total lessons, and a number for completion rate. Okay. Okay, so as you can see, yeah, the response is starting to get quite large. So we're getting metadata about the course. We're getting the many-to-many fields back as well. This time it's essentially just giving us the ID of those fields in an array. We're getting the instructors, which is using the serialization from the user serializer. Then we're getting the modules, which once again is an array because the modules are utilizing the module serializer. Now, if I just go back to the course model very quickly, notice that there isn't a definition for modules as a field within the course model. However, if we go to the module field, these two are linked by the fact that the module field has a foreign key relationship with the course. And it's kind of a reverse relationship, which means that because we're defining here related name equals to modules, if we have a module object and we try to find out what course that module is in, then we can simply just, access it from the course property here. However, in the reverse order, if we have a course object and we want to figure out what modules it has, we can do exactly the same thing by using a modules property, because we've defined it as the related name here. So if we go to our serializers, the reason why we're able to leverage the modules here is because of that reverse relationship using the foreign key field. So when you have a course object, it automatically knows that the modules are related to the modules field, which has been linked through the foreign key, and therefore it's able to fetch all of those modules and serialize them all into arrays like this. And then within each module, we then actually have the lessons as well. Once again, leveraging the module serializer from above. Finally, the two computed fields. So we've got total lessons, that's come back with 1, and completion rate is equal to null. So that's pretty much expected. Now let's go to the next serializer. Let's try the course minimal serializer. So let's copy the last command. We want a course object. However, we're going to use the course minimal serializer now. As you can see, this just returns very basic and much smaller payload. So for certain use cases, this is going to be much more ideal, because as you can see, this is quite a lot of information that's being sent back from the course serializer. And now let's use the dynamic serializer. So what this expects is for you to pass in some keyword arguments, and within that keyword argument you want a fields key and you want an array of fields. So if I just pass in ID as an example, it will literally just return me the ID. If I was to say ID and slug, I get those two fields back. So this is really useful, and this can be powerful across our application. Okay, a couple more. Let's go through the enrollment serializer. So now let's get rid of these keyword arguments here. Let's go to the enrollment model and then the enrollment serializer. So this returns a lot of data, in fact. Let's just double check the definition of the serializer here. So we're not only just returning the course, but also the user and the progress percentage as well. So we know that the course includes quite a lot of information already, so we could even leverage one of the minimal serializers here if we wanted to. And then once we have the course, we then also have the lesson who's enrolled on the course, when they're enrolled at, and the progress as a percentage, which is 0 at the moment. Okay, that all looks good. Finally, let's do the lesson progress serializer. So let's remove these keyword arguments again. Let's find a lesson progress object. And then let's pass that through the serializer. So what we have here, we should have an object for the user from the user serializer and an object from the lesson, as well as some other fields from the lesson progress model as well. And as expected, that's exactly what we've got. Let me just run this again, because as I've been scrolling up and down, I think the output on the terminal is just jumping around a bit. Here we go. So we've got our user model, we've got our lesson serialized, and then we've got whether it's completed, when it was completed at, and some more metadata fields too. So this has given you an overview of how to get your application, your API layer, production ready using serializers. Some of these techniques and methods will be massively valuable to you when building out full stack applications. Now in the next lesson, because we have now covered the database, the serializers, which is sort of the layer in between the database and your views, we're next going to cover creating those views that are going to leverage the serializers, which will then also leverage the models that we've created. And there's some really clever stuff that we'll do within the views to make the database queries as efficient as possible. So I hope you're enjoying this Django course. If you are, feel free to give it a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell as well, so that you get notified as soon as the new part of the course comes out. And since you're still here, why not check out some of my other videos, including all different types of Python tutorials, and specifically my top 10 tips as a CTO in Django. Apart from that, I'll see you soon.